Chesapeake Bay habitats and biodiversity. The mixing of fresh water with salt water from the Atlantic and the Chesapeake Bay creates the nation's largest estuary. It's home to more than 3,700 species of plants and animals. Estuaries are highly productive environments because they provide a variety of habitats, which in turn support a great diversity of life. About half of the Chesapeake's water volume comes from the salt water of the Atlantic Ocean. The other half comes from freshwater rivers and streams that drain into the bay from its 6,400 square mile watershed. The Chesapeake Estuary, the surrounding watershed, and the variety of organisms that live in this environment make up the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem. All elements of this ecosystem interact with one another in some way, depending directly or indirectly on each other for survival. There are 6 ecosystems of the Chesapeake Bay: forest, rivers and streams, aquatic reefs and pilings, beach and tidal flats, marshes and wetlands, open and shallow waters. Forests are critical to the health of the Chesapeake Bay. Large areas of trees perform important ecological functions, such as cleaning our water and air. Forests provide clean water. They're like giant sponges. They trap pollutants and nutrients from flowing into our rivers and streams. Streamside forest, also known as riparian buffers, can reduce the amount of nutrients running into waterways by as much as 30 to 90%. Forests currently buffer about 60% of the streams and rivers that flow into the bay. Mature trees have deep root systems that hold soil in place, helping to stabilize the stream banks and reduce erosion. Forests protect clean air. Through the process known as attenuation, tree roots, leaves, and forest soils can absorb and trap pollutants in the air. Forests can capture more than 85% of the nitrogen that falls on them from the air, keeping it from running into our waterways. Excess nitrogen in our water can fuel the growth of algae blooms, which block light from reaching submerged aquatic vegetation and decrease oxygen levels. Low or no oxygen creates dead zones where marine life cannot survive. And most importantly, trees produce the oxygen we breathe. Forests create habitats. They provide food, shelter, nesting sites, and safe migration paths for critters in the water and on the land. Interior forests, or those that are not near the forest edge or any other land use, provide dwelling spaces with moderate temperatures and light levels. Only 40% of the Chesapeake's forest are considered interior habitat. Streamside forests shade the waters that run beneath their leafy canopies. They maintain cooler water temperatures and reduce stress on sensitive fish. The leaves and other plant materials that fall into the water create a nice habitat for underwater critters. Standing dead trees provide habitat to owls, woodpeckers, squirrels, and other animals that nest in tree cavities. Many insects, small mammals, and birds can be found foraging and living among the decomposing logs, stumps, and leaves on the forest floor. Streams and rivers not only provide the Chesapeake Bay with its fresh water, they also provide many aquatic species with a critical habitat. Fish, invertebrates, amphibians, and other wildlife species all depend on the bay's tributaries for survival. When the Chesapeake streams and rivers are in poor health, so is the bay, and a wide array of wildlife it harbors is put in danger. There are hundreds and thousands of streams, creeks, and rivers throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed that eventually flow into the bay. These freshwater tributaries provide critical habitat for many plants and animals. Fish that spend their entire lives in freshwater are catfish, sunfish, and brook trout. They are also part of the Chesapeake Bay system. Fish that travel from the bay to the ocean to freshwater streams to spawn are shad, Atlantic sturgeon, and striped bass. Fish are not the only creatures that live in rivers and streams. There are many invertebrates such as worms, clams, and other shellfish. There are also many plant and amphibian species. Aquatic reefs are complex and diverse communities made mostly of densely packed oysters. Hundreds of aquatic animals find food and shelter in oyster reefs. They have many nooks and crannies that provide a safe haven for small fish and invertebrates to hide from predators. Larger species, including white perch, striped bass, and blue crabs, visit reefs to breed and find food. Reefs are the largest source of hard surface in the bay's bottom, which is usually covered with soft sediment. Oyster larvae, sponges, and barnacles are just a few of the many invertebrates that live attached to the hard surfaces. Other hard surfaces in the bay are piers, rocks, jetties, and pilings. These surfaces provide hard surfaces for invertebrates. Sandy beaches and tidal mudflats line thousands of miles of the Chesapeake Bay shoreline. Beaches are usually found along the lower bay. Mudflats are common in the upper bay. Beaches are harsh environments where wildlife are subject to wind, waves, and heat. Beaches and tidal flats support a wide variety of plants and animals, including birds, mammals, insects, and invertebrates. Sandpipers and small crabs scurry along the water's edge. Gulls and terns fly above. Underneath the sand, mud, worms, clams, and crabs burrow to avoid predators. Wetlands are transitional areas between land and water. Marshes are a type of wetland along the shoreline where aquatic grasses and sedges grow. Hundreds of species of fish, birds, mammals, reptiles, and invertebrates depend on marshes and wetlands for food. Thousands of aquatic species, including worms, periwinkles, insects, and ribbed mussels, thrive in wetlands. In turn, larger animals eat these smaller species. Marshes and wetlands provide shelter for a variety of animals. 2/3 of the nation's commercial fish and shellfish depend on wetlands as nurseries or spawning areas. Large flocks of waterfowl visit the wetlands during their winter migrations to feed and rest. Mammals, such as muskrats and beavers, build their homes in the wetlands. Open waters provide a haven for migratory fish, such as bluefish, cobia, and mackerels. Migratory fish visit the bay in the summer to feast on menhaden, anchovies, and other small fish and invertebrates. Microscopic plankton float through the open waters, forming the base of the bay's food chain. In the summer, both the shallows and open waters become very warm, making them subject to large algae blooms. Algae blooms can lead to low oxygen dead zones that suffocate underwater life in the winter. Animals that dwell in the shallows generally retreat to deeper, warmer waters. Hundreds and thousands of migratory birds stop on the Chesapeake's open waters to rest and feed. Shallows. Along the shores of the Chesapeake Bay is an area of incredible biological activity, the shallows. The shallows extend from the shore to about 10 feet. Beyond the shoreline are the open waters of the bay, with channels up to 100 feet deep. Many small fish seek refuge from predators in shallow waters. Larger fish and birds hunt for prey there. Bay grasses are a critical part of the shallow. Important bay organisms. Oysters. Why are oysters important to the bay? You don't have to like eating this bivalve to appreciate its role in the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem and its importance to the people in the region. First of all, they clean the water. They are natural filter feeders. This means that they feed by pumping water through their gills, trapping particles of food as well as nutrients, suspended sediments, and chemical contaminants. In doing so, oysters help keep the water clean and clear for underwater grasses and other aquatic life. One oyster can filter more than 50 gallons of water in a single day. They provide food and habitat. As an oyster grows, larvae settles on top of the adults, forming layers of oysters that spread upward and outward. With their countless nooks and crannies, these aquatic reefs provide habitat to hundreds of critters, from small fish and invertebrates seeking shelter to larger fish looking for food. Oysters have a number of natural predators. Anemones, sea nettles, and other filter feeders feed on oyster larvae. Flatworms and mud crabs feed on new spat. Blue crabs and some fish feed on older spat and first-year oysters. Shorebirds feed on adult oysters exposed on intertidal flats. What has caused the Chesapeake Bay oyster population to decline? The decline of the native oyster population can be attributed to several factors, including historic overharvesting, disease, and habitat loss. The severity of this decline is often illustrated in terms of its impact on water quality. In the late 19th century, the bay's oysters could filter a volume of water equal to that of the entire bay in 3 or 4 days. Today's population takes nearly a year to filter the same amount. Historic overharvesting in the 17th century, huge numbers of oysters lived in the bay. European settlers reported enormous oyster reefs that thrust upward from the bay's bottom, posing navigational hazards to their ships. Overharvesting removed large volumes of oysters from the bay and led to the demise of the bay's healthy reefs. Because these reefs have been scraped away by dredges, oyster beds are now limited to flat, thin layers of dead shells and live oysters spread over the bay's bottom. These damaged habitats offer less surface area for reef-dwelling critters to inhabit and can be easily buried by sediment. One of the ways of restoration is managing the oyster harvest. It can ensure that the region's oyster industry remains stable. It requires estimating the amount of oysters that can be taken from the bay without compromising restoration efforts or population size. In 1949, scientists discovered dermo in the bay. The MSX was discovered in a region a decade later. Dermo is a parasite that most often infects oysters during their second year of life, causing slow growth rates and death. MSX also leads to oyster death, but can affect oysters of all ages. Both diseases are contracted between May and October, and their prevalence can be affected by water temperature and salinity. Overcoming the effects of dermo and MSX has posed challenges to the oyster restoration. This is one of the reasons that you're told to only eat oysters during months that have an R. Disease prevention. Maryland and Virginia have to confront a lot of different challenges when it comes to oyster disease. While the prevalence of disease in Maryland is dependent on weather conditions, oysters in the warmer, saltier waters of Virginia are faced with constant disease pressure. But research from VIMS, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, has found that oysters subject to high disease pressures are developing a disease resistance and becoming stronger. Habitat loss. Over the past century, the watershed has experienced a huge change in land use, as urban, suburban, and agricultural areas have replaced forested lands. This has increased the amount of nutrients and sediment entering the river and streams and contributing to poor water quality. Excess nutrients for existence fuel the growth of algae blooms and create dead zones. that hinder the development of oyster larvae. To fight this, oyster sanctuaries have been made. Oyster sanctuaries are underwater reefs from which shellfish harvesting is prohibited. When a reef is designated sanctuary, it is often improved by scientists to clean off excess sediment and add shells or other materials for new spat to settle on. Why are blue crabs important? Well, they're both a predator and a prey. Blue crabs are a keystone species in the Chesapeake Bay food web. The crustaceans are both predators and prey in the bay's food web. Blue crab larvae are part of the bay's planktonic community, serving as food for menhaden, oysters, and other filter feeders. Juvenile and adult crabs serve as food for fish, birds, and even other blue crabs. Striped bass, red drum, catfish, and some sharks depend on them as part of their diet. Blue crabs are among the top consumers of bottom-dwelling organisms, or benthos. Opportunistic feeders, they eat thin-shelled bivalves, small crustaceans, freshly dead fish, plants, and animal detritus, almost anything else that they can find. Blue crabs also support a very large recreational fishery in the bay. One reason for the decline of populations of blue crabs is habitat loss. Blue crabs use underwater grass beds as nursery and feeding grounds. A drop in underwater grass abundance due to warming waters, irregular weather patterns, and pollution has been a link to the decline of the blue crab. Water quality improvements and underwater grass restoration and proper harvest management will help protect blue crab populations and maintain the resource into the future. Another reason for decline is harvest pressure. More than 1/3 of the nation's blue crab catch comes from the Chesapeake Bay. Blue crabs, harvested as hardshell crabs, peeler crabs, and softshell crabs, are the highest valued commercial fishery in the bay and bring in millions of dollars each year. Blue crabs also support a recreational fishery in the region. Management. Blue crabs are managed as a single species, using minimum catch sizes and seasonal harvest limits to meet the targets of fishing pressure. The annual winter dredge surveys help scientists determine whether the target blue crab harvest has been met or exceeded. Under this strategy, target fishing pressure is set to a level that should allow for the increase in the blue crab abundance over time. Predation. Debate has grown over the effect of predation on blue crab abundance. Striped bass, Atlantic croaker, red drum, and other fish feed on juvenile blue crabs, and a change in these fish species populations could affect the abundance of blue crab recruits, or those crabs that are less than a year old. This is part of the natural food web and doesn't need to be changed. Why are menhaden important? Atlantic menhaden are crucial to the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem, forming an important link in the food chain. Menhaden also support one of the largest commercial fisheries on the Atlantic coast. Menhaden are filter feeders capable of filtering up to 7 gallons of water each minute. Marine mammals and fish-eating birds, including osprey, cormorants, and bald eagles, also rely on menhaden as well as other important forage species as a source of their food. The economic importance of the fisheries. The menhaden support one of the largest commercial harvests in the Atlantic coast. While the fish is too small and oily to eat, menhaden are harvested for other purposes, including fertilizer, animal feed, human and animal supplements, cosmetics, and bait. There are two types of fisheries for menhaden. The reduction industry, which harvests the fish to produce fish meal and fish oil, began in New England in the 1800s. The bait fishery has been growing since 1985 and now makes up about a quarter of the menhaden harvest along the Atlantic coast. So how are they harvested in the bay? Small planes, called spotter planes, are used to find the menhaden schools. Boats travel in a circle around the menhaden schools in order to trap the fish. The net is pursed or closed, and the fish are vacuumed out of the water and into refrigerated containers. This method of harvesting is known as purse seining and is the primary method for harvesting menhaden for the reduction fishery. Menhaden are also caught with pound nets, which are strung between stakes in the water. Small purse seines, which are fish traps similar to pound nets, and gill nets are also used to harvest menhaden as bait along the coast. Menhaden in the news. The nation's Secretary of Commerce said in December that he would shut down the Chesapeake Bay's menhaden fishery if the company that accounts for the vast majority of it doesn't comply with federal quotas by June 17th. Federal fisheries managers recently found Virginia out of compliance for allowing the company, Omega Protein Corporation, to surpass the Bay quota. Secretary Wilbur Ross issued a statement stating that the Canadian-owned company willfully violated the fishing cap on menhaden inside the Chesapeake Bay, continuing to fish after the federally ordered quota of 51,000 tons had been met. Though there is no industrial-scale menhaden fishery in Maryland, the fish caught in Virginia waters are still a food source for striped bass and other migratory fish that spend much of the time in Maryland's waters. Menhaden are the only saltwater fish in Virginia waters governed by the state's General Assembly instead of the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. Omega this year caught more than 35 million pounds over the Bay quota, citing several reasons for its continued harvest, including the weather was too bad to allow its crews to fish in the ocean, and the fact that state legislators never adopted the federal quota. The company even publicly declared that it would fish beyond the federally mandated limit. Omega has long complained that quotas aren't based on science. Omega did not say whether it will now begin complying with the quota.